All right, you should have got an announcement, and we are live now. So welcome, everybody. Today we're going to be, as noted, going through what it's like to build a guessing game. So it's going to be a very simple guessing game, but we are going to get into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML, we can kind of think of it as the foundation of a web page. Essentially, like if you wanted to lay out, if you saw like a blueprint for a house before where there's like a kitchen, there's a living room, there's a bathroom, HTML allows us to essentially build those walls, to build the structure. CSS is used to style that structure. So once we've built our structure, we'll be doing some styling on it. And then after that, we'll be using JavaScript to implement some functionality. So I'll go ahead and get a screen share going. Oh, a couple things I do want to touch on briefly. You will notice at the bottom of the Zoom window, there is a reactions panel, reactions button, kind of looks like a smiley face. If you click on that, you will see a collection of things that you can do, things like clapping. You can give a heart if you're really enjoying what's going on. We can laugh with joy if something extraordinarily funny happens. But really what we're focusing on is the raise hand. So if we click on raise hand, it will raise our hand. It will also move you to the top left of the screen from my perspective. And it makes it really easy to see who might have a question. So as we're going through this, go ahead and raise your hand if you do have a question. And then as soon as, if I'm like in the middle of coding something out, as soon as I'm done, I'll go ahead and call on you and then we can answer that question for you. Does it sound good, everybody? Cool. I'm going to guess it sounds good. All right. Thank you, Clarence. Appreciate that thumbs up. Picking it up. All right. So let's go ahead and share our screen. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a brief look at what we're going to be building tonight. All right, so what we are going to be constructing is this little guessing game here. So this guessing game says, please choose a number between 1 and 25. We'll go ahead and start with 12 and kind of split the difference on that. If we submit a guess, it will let us know, okay, your guess was too high. Okay, so apparently the number 12 between 1 and 25 was too high. Let's split that difference and go to 6. Let's see what that gives us. Our guess is still too high. All right, this got a low one. Let's try 3. The guess is still too high. Now, is it 1 or 2? I have a 50-50 chance. Let's go ahead and try 1. Oh, that 50-50 sometimes doesn't work out. We can guess that it's 2, but let's confirm. And there it is. You have guessed correctly. So basically, the functionality that we're going to be designing is this little page here. And then it'll let us know as we put in guesses whether or not those guesses are correct. All right. If you're going to be coding with us tonight, I will be coding inside of VS Code. Show you what that looks like. So VS Code is what's called an IDE or an integrated development environment. And essentially, it's kind of like, you can think of it as like Word or like Google Docs, but for writing code. It has nice little shortcuts built into it, and it'll autocomplete stuff for you. And it just makes a developer's life a lot easier to use an actual IDE. If you don't have anything set up like this and you do want to code along tonight, CodePen would be my recommendation. Now I'm going to share this link in the chat. There we go. I close the chat. I had it open. There we go. So if you go to this link, I can demonstrate it real quick. I'll go ahead and log out from my, oh, that's not what I wanted. I can log out for myself. So once you go to this link, this is what it should look like when you arrive there. You don't have to sign up and create an account, but if you want to save any of the work that you're going to be completing tonight, you do have to sign up. So what you can do if you want to do that and not give a whole bunch of your information away, they have options to sign up with Google, GitHub, or Facebook. And either one of those, if you click on it, it'll just pop up a little window that says, please enter the email and password that you'd like to use for those accounts. Or you can go ahead and sign up with an email just directly to CodePen if you'd like. Again, not a requirement, but just wanted to touch on something in case you wanted to work through this and save the code yourself and you didn't have an environment like a VS Code or something, you can do everything in CodePen. I will also be posting the code that I generate in CodePen, and I will be posting it in the chat as we go along. So as I complete chunks of it, I'll be posting the code, so you can always just copy and paste directly into CodePen if you want to do that. And if you don't want to do that and just observe, you're welcome to do that too. So we're a low stress environment here. All right, so now that we have kind of seen the functionality that we want to build, the next thing that we want to look at is kind of think about it like a programmer and look at the problem that we're trying to solve, and then a breakdown of that into individual steps. So if we were to look at an overview for what a guessing game would look like, the goal for this workshop is to create a working number guessing game that allows a user to make a guess and get feedback on whether or not the guess was correct. And we could see that from the functionality that we had here. Now, for that, the base functionality requirements include only two things. One, the user will be trying to guess a number between 1 and 25 inclusive. Inclusive meaning that it could be the number 1 and the number 25, so any integer value between 1 and 25. And that the game must let the user know if the guess was too high, too low, or correct, so that we can get some type of feedback. Now, once that functionality is completed, if you wanted to add additional functionality to this, and we will be having some videos that are posted so that you could follow along if you wanted to and add that functionality. We could do things like after the user guesses correctly, they have the option to play again with a new number to guess. We could also say that the number of guesses per round are limited, and the user would lose if they didn't guess within that limit. So say they have 5 chances to guess, and if they don't, the round is over. Or we could allow the user to control the range of possible numbers. So as we can see here, by default, we're working with 1 to 25, but we could add functionality to extend that to 1 to 100, 5 to 20, whatever it is that the user wants. Okay, so now that we have that broken down as far as what our functionality is going to include, we want to break it down into simple steps that we can complete. So there's 2 main steps that we need for a guessing game. The first one is there needs to be a way to enter a guess. And the second one is there needs to be a way to check the guess and let the user know if the guess was correct. The first thing that we're going to be doing is completing this section up here. Needs to be a way to enter the guess, and we're going to be doing that using HTML and CSS. So the first thing that we can see as far as something to accomplish is a heading will contain the game title. Because if we look at the page right here, we can see that we have a little title for the game that says guessing game. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is to create that. So if we go into VS Code, I want to take a look at some of this, this code that we start out with, which is called an HTML skeleton, and kind of give a little bit of a breakdown of what's going on here. So if we look at CodePen briefly, we'll notice that we have an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. So the way that CodePen works is that these files are automatically linked, and they're all ready to go if we want to do something with them. For example, if I were to type H1 inside of the HTML and then hit tab, that will autocomplete an opening and closing H1 tag. We call those an HTML tags, and they typically have opening and closing tags. And then between them, we could put some text. So I could put something like, hi, I am text. Little exclamation mark to put something on it. And then we'll notice down here in the output for CodePen that it puts the text that I have in there. So we'll notice when I look at our index.html file inside of the code editor that there's all these other tags that are included. These tags also exist for CodePen. You just don't have to interact with them or use them. All of the code that you would put into CodePen would exist between 2 tags on a standard HTML skeleton, and that would be the body tags. So we have an opening and closing body tag. But before we get to that, I do want to take a look briefly at these other elements so we can get kind of a better idea about how HTML is structured and what these tags mean. At the top here on line 1, we'll see a doctype HTML tag. This tag is unique in HTML, meaning it's a special kind of tag. And what it does is it tells the browser that's running the website or running the file what version of HTML you're using. HTML5 is the current version, and that's the one that we're using, and that's what this doctype refers to. So it's just worth knowing that we're telling the browser essentially, and it doesn't matter which browser, whether it's Chrome, Mozilla, Brave, custom browsers, this is the tag that tells the browser, hey, this is an HTML file, prepare for it, essentially. So this lets us know what the HTML type is. Now below that, we have an opening tag for HTML. It has language set to English. And then we have a closing tag for HTML. So all of the HTML that we'll be writing for the actual web page is going to be contained within the HTML tags, the opening and the closing tag. All right, below that, we have an opening tag for the head and a closing tag. So the head tag is designed to hold generally what they refer to as meta information or configuration information about the web page. It also holds things like here we're telling it what character set we're going to use, and this is like the standard US one. We're telling it here like what type of viewport that we're going to be using. Here we have a link, and this is how we connect our style CSS file. So like in CodePen, where they have their CSS file, we also have a CSS file, and the way that the HTML file can access it is through this link right here. And it's basically just saying that, hey, this link is going to be pointing to a style sheet, and this is where that style sheet is located. And we can see over here, there's a style CSS. We also have a title tag, which is responsible for the titles that you see at the top of your tabs. And if you ever make bookmarks, the title value is the one that gets stored as the bookmark. Something interesting worth knowing. So the head is pretty much, again, for configuration information and information about the page. Now that does bring us down to, as mentioned, the body tags. So all the code that we write between the opening and closing body tag is the information that we're expecting to show up on the actual website. This is the stuff that will be displayed. So when you go to a website and you see images, links, all those things, all that stuff is contained typically within the body. We do have one more tag that's worth talking about, and that is our opening and closing script tags. It has an attribute on it named src, and that points to our JS file. So like in CodePen, where you have a JS file where you can write your JavaScript code, we also have a file that's for that. And the way that it's connected to the index.html file is by this script tag. All right. So just a few things that we definitely want to be aware of before we get started. Now, taking us back to where we were originally, the first thing that we have under there needs to be a way to enter a guess is a heading will contain the game title. So if we were to look at the H1 tag and we want to put in our the title, we would do guessing game. All right, so when I save my file, let me go ahead and open it in the browser. We'll see that now guessing game is showing up. And if you put the same stuff into CodePen, just to say briefly, instead of changing it from H1, we can do guessing game. And in a second, it'll pop up. All right, so we have our title in there. That actually wasn't too difficult. That makes things easy. If we were to look at the next step, oh, let's not do that. Our next step is a form will be used to enter the guess. So the next thing that we're going to include in our HTML is a form tag. So when you create your form tag, either in CodePen or here in our VS Code, it's going to create the tag automatically with this attribute called action. So the action attribute is actually one that we don't need to use for the purposes of this game, but it is worth knowing what it is. So what action is it's an attribute that allows you to give it a URL or a web address to a server. So if we wanted to submit this form and have the data from it go to a server and be used for something, then we would do that within the action. And again, in this case, we're not going to be using a server for this. So you can delete it or leave it. It really doesn't matter. It's not going to affect the functionality, but it's just worth pointing out why it's there. Okay, so once we have our form tag, we can go ahead and open that up. And if we look back at our example, there we go. If we look back at our example, we'll see that we have a few things beyond the guessing game. We have some text here that's letting us know what number we should be choosing between. We have an input that we can add the value into. And then we have a submit button that allow us to actually submit the form. So all of these elements are going to be contained within the form element because the form is going to be in control of them, essentially. All right, so if we go back to our code, inside of our form, the first thing that we're going to be creating is a label element, if I could spell. So we do label like that. And we'll notice that it auto-generates with this for attribute. Now, the purpose of this attribute is to link the label to the input that we're going to create. And we'll see how that works in just a second. We don't need to put anything in there for now, but what we do want to put is the same text that we have for the game. So please choose a number between 1 and 25. So I'll go ahead and add that, and you can add that to yours if you're coding along. So please choose a number between 1 and 25. All right. Yeah, the question, I am using VS Code. This is recorded, so it will be posted and available to you. Awesome. Good question. All right. So we have our please choose an, oh, not equals 25. So it happens when we look away. So now we have a label that says, please choose a number between 1 and 25. And if we go back to our output, that's what we have now. So guessing game and please choose a number between 1 and 25. So we are on our way. Okay. So the next step here is going to be to create an input element. So right below the label, we can type input. And by default, it's going to give us a text input. Now, inputs come in a lot of different styles. You can get text inputs, you can get email inputs, you can get password inputs. If you've ever used one of those inputs where you're typing stuff in and it turns it into like little dots or asterisks as you're doing so, that would be a password input. And that's kind of just built into input functionality. So let's go ahead and we're going to change it to a type number because we're going to be dealing with numbers for our guessing game, and that's going to be the best one for us to use. All right. So now that we have our input, we can go back and check our output, and we can see that we have our please choose a number between 1 and 25, and then we have a little input in there. Also notice that we did create a number input, as we can see here. So you will not be able to type letters into a number input with the exception of E. So in case you're doing like scientific notation and you needed to do like E to some power, it does allow that because it is technically number related. But beyond that, you can't put any other letters and it will just accept numbers. And that's what we want because we're dealing with a guessing game that's specifically dealing with numbers. All right. So we have an input in there. It looks like the next thing that we're going to be putting together is a button. So right below the input, we're going to type button and then auto-complete that using tab. And then if we look at our example, we can see here that it says submit guess is what we're expecting to have there. Okay, so let's go ahead and add that. All right, so once we save that and go back and check, we now have our submit guess button. Okay, so we're getting there. Now, if we look at the input, we will notice that it doesn't have anything inside of it. If we look at our example, it does say input guess. So we want to make sure to add that text to it. So the way that we'll do that on the input is we'll go to the input and we're going to add a new attribute to it. And the name of that attribute is placeholder. Oh, that was not the right characters. There we go. So placeholder, and then we can just say input guess because that's what we have as the example. So once we save that, we will now see that that input guess text has been added. So we're in good shape for that. All right, so we got that going. Let's see what else we have. Now we want to connect the label to the input. So if we go to the example, you'll notice that when I click on the label, that it puts focus on the input, and you can see that blue line that appears around it. So once again, if I click away from it, it's not highlighted. If I click on the label, it is highlighted. And that's where that for attribute on the label comes in. So what we can do is on the for, we're going to give it a value of guess. All right. So we have a guess value for for. In order to connect that to the input, we have to give the input an ID value because the for, that's exactly what it's looking for. It's looking for an ID value. So if we give that the value of guess, then we should be able to go back to our output. And if I click on the label, it'll highlight the input. All right, so far we've gotten to the point where we've connected our label to our input and we have a button ready to go. So we are moving along. There are a couple more things that we want to add to the input though. And the first of those things is going to be another attribute. And that one's going to be name. So name, when you put on an input, is the name that we're going to use in JavaScript in order to access the input once the form has been submitted. So it's important that we give this a name that kind of matches the input that it's expecting to get. And what we can do for that is we can just give it another guess. It's a perfect one. Because what is the input holding? The guess. So we can call it guess. All right. I think that's all the stuff we need to hit on it for now. If we go back to our example, everything's looking okay. We have our stuff set up. So I'm going to head and go ahead, if I could talk. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it in the chat. So if anybody's following along and they want to have this in their code pen, you can go ahead and copy and paste that. I'll also paste it on my end so that we can see what our current output is. And then there we go. So it looks like it's lining up correctly so far. We seem to be in a pretty good spot. All right, now, the thing that we definitely want to notice is the difference in styling. Now that we have a big chunk of our HTML completed, we want to look at the styling of our example output versus what we currently have. So let's look at those side to side. All right. So looking between these two, who could give me some difference that exists between them, something that we'll have to correct? And it's okay if you're shy, I'll just say a bunch of stuff. Well, we got one centered. Thank you, Melissa. Okay, so definitely one of the things we notice is that it's centered. Now, Melissa, is it centered just horizontally or is it also centered vertically? Both, yeah. So we're both centering horizontally and vertically. Does anybody else notice anything else? Oh, fonts and size. Okay, that's definitely right. So if we look here, now these are both bold, but our example that we've been building so far, it's definitely more bold. So we're gonna have to do something about that. All right, and the font sizes. If we look at the font sizes here, these font sizes are definitely bigger than these font sizes. That's something else to be aware of. Does anybody else notice that these elements are stacked vertically? Right? Because right now, all of these elements are just sitting across from each other. And let's look at why that's happening before we get into the CSS. So if we right click on the page and click inspect, I'll make sure to point that out, it'll open up our dev tools. Now the dev tools are extraordinarily useful for many things, whether you're doing HTML and CSS or JavaScript, because it allows us to kind of see behind the scenes of what's going on. So once I open up our dev tools, if I highlight an element, we can see on the screen that it highlights where that element exists on the page and how much space it takes up. So if we have the H1 highlighted, we'll see that it takes up the entire width of the page, essentially outside of those little white ends on the side. And then we have this blue area, which represents the content of the element. And then kind of this creamsicle color on either side, and that represents margin. So by default, and we can see that here, the H1 element has some CSS that's built into it. It's labeled as user agent style sheet. And what that means is this is the browser's default CSS for those elements. At the most part, at this point, browsers are pretty much the same. There are some differences though. In the old days, there was huge differences, but now they've been pretty much brought down to mean the same thing. And there's a couple things that we want to look at. One is display block. So what display block means, and I can highlight it and demonstrate that, display block means I only want this element to exist on this line and nothing can sit next to me. Because we can see that we have a form right next to it, but it's on a whole nother line. And that's because block will not allow other elements to sit next to it. Now, if we look at the form itself, it's also display block. And when we highlight it, it takes up the entire width of the page. So we have the same display functionality set up for both of those elements, but that's going to change once we get to the input and the button. We'll notice if we look at the label, it does not have one by default, but it is inline block is what we're looking for there. And we'll notice on the input has a lot of possibilities for stuff, but if we go down to display, it's set to inline block. The button is also inline block. Where's display? There it is. Inline block. So what inline block means is that by default, this element will only take up the size of its content, and that's it. But if we want to, we can make it bigger. So that's why the label, the input, and the button will all sit next to each other on a single line. That's because, again, they are inline block elements. So by default, they're only going to take up as much space as they need. And they're not going to take up the whole line and be greedy, kind of like the H1 is. So in order to get our styling in order, we're going to have to make a couple of small changes to the HTML, and then we're going to have to bring in some CSS in order to change this into this. All right, so the way that we're going to do that, the first thing we're going to do in our HTML is that we're going to create a new box, and we're going to do that with a div element. Now, a div element is essentially just a divider element. It allows you to create a box, and then it will contain whatever you want to put in it. What we do want to put in it is our form and our H1. So I'm going to go ahead and copy those, paste them here. I do have to adjust my formatting a little bit because programmers get twitchy about that kind of stuff. But now we have a div element that is containing our H1 and our form. All right, and if we go ahead and save that and then go back to our page, let's inspect it and take a look at what the div does. So now when I highlight the div, we see that it takes up all of the space that contains both the heading and the form, but it doesn't take up any more space than that. It's only the horizontal space that it takes up. So we have no height. The reason, well, not no height, but we don't have any height beyond the content. And by default, when we're using HTML, it doesn't have any height beyond the content of the element. So whatever the element content is, that's how tall it's going to be. Now, because of that, we will not be able to center anything because we don't have enough vertical height to center within. So the first thing, well, not the first thing we're going to do, but the second thing we're going to do is add some height. The first thing we're going to do is update the font so that it matches this one. So we reduce that boldness a little bit. All right. So if we go to our style CSS, we're going to input what is called a selector. So the way that CSS is able to apply styling to elements is by using selectors, essentially saying, this thing, whatever element has this thing on it, I want to apply this styling to. The first one that we're going to use is an H1 selector. So an H1 selector means that any H1 elements, I want them to have this styling associated with them. All right. So we create an H1, just a selector that matches the tag name. We then have an opening and closing curly brace. And inside of it, we're going to add a key value pair, which is two things. One is as a property of the CSS property we want to use, and then a value that we want to use for that property. So for this one, we're going to use what's called font weight. Ooh, get excited typing sometimes. All right, so we're going to font weight, we put a colon, and then we put the value of 400, because that's the one that we want to use. After that, we add a semicolon. CSS is very severe about semicolons. If you're missing a semicolon, no code after it will run, because basically the browser can't read and interpret it. It doesn't know what to do with it. So we're going to go ahead and save that to our font weight of 400. And now when we go back to the example, oh, look at that. We reduced the bold, because I think it's about font weight 800 by default. So we cut that down a little bit, and now we have a matching boldness to it. All right, very cool. So of course not it, that's our first thing. And we created an H1 selector here, but there are a downside to using selectors. The downside to using selectors is that we had a web page that had a bunch more elements in it. Let's say it had 3 or 4 H1 elements. Then anything we put in a tag selector is going to affect those elements. And we don't necessarily want to do that in all cases. In this case, it's totally fine because we just have the one H1 element in our HTML. But selectors can be dangerous like that sometimes because they might select elements that you don't want to select. So another way, or another common selector that's used in CSS, probably the most common selector, is called a class. So we can create class selectors and then add those individually to elements that we want to style. The first one that we're going to create is called container. So the container class is going to hold the height that we're going to add to our div so that it takes up the full height of the page. All right, so we're going to add height as the property, and the value we're going to give it is 97 VH. Now, what 97 VH means, VH is a percentage of the height of the window that you're working within. So if like we look at this window, the height would be calculated for VH would be from here to the bottom. So it's essentially just saying like 97% of the page height is what we want to use. Okay, so we have our class made. We can copy that. Well, let me save it. We can copy that and then go back to our index.html. And the element we want to add it on is the div. So to add a class, we add an attribute named class. And then we just put the value of the class that we want to add. All right, so once we've done that and saved it, if we go back here and inspect, our expectation is that the height now encompasses the whole page. So notice now that when we highlight the container, it actually gives us the whole page. So now we actually have the space to vertically center the elements when we're ready to do that. Okay, cool. Still looking good on questions. Okay. All right, so I'm going to copy the current update and put that in the code pen, and I'll also give it to everybody. And then as we go along, we'll definitely see more changes coming. All right, so we go ahead and put that there. We put the CSS in the chat and the updated HTML. All right, so now that we've completed that, we're going to look into the next stuff that we have to do. Okay, so we talked about how it's centered, so that's definitely something that we want to approach. There's a lot of ways that can be done in CSS. The most contemporary way and kind of the new way things are done is by using a system called Flexbox. There's also options for another system called Grid, but that one can get pretty complicated, and what we want to do is keep things simple for our first run through. So in order to use Flexbox, that's a display property. Remember we talked about display block and inline block? Well, now we're going to create a new class called dflex. And that class is going to have the display property in it. And the value that we're going to give it is flex. All right, so for dflex, we're going to add this class in a couple places in our index.html. The first place that we're going to add it is on our div with the class of container. So let's go ahead and do that and then look at our output. Oh, it's changed quite a bit. So no longer are the elements, we have the guessing game and then the form beneath it. They've now all moved on to a single line. And if we inspect the page, if I highlight the div, we can see that, yeah, all the elements are in one horizontal line. The reason that that's done that way is that by default, Flex will take whatever elements of its children elements, so in this case, the H1 and the form, and it will put them into a single horizontal line. So that's its default behavior. All right, and it's doing what it's supposed to do, so far, so good. The next place that we're going to add that, let's go back to the code editor, is to our form element. Because we'd use dflex on this container, and it put all of the elements in a single line. But an important thing to know about Flex is that Flex only works on direct children. So this Flex on this div is controlling this H1 and the form. It is not controlling the label, the input, or the button. It only works on direct children. So those that are like indented one level or a single level down. So if we want to use Flex on the form, we have to add it directly. So we can do that by adding class, and then we'll put the same class name. And here we can kind of start seeing the utility of using class names, because if we need them in multiple places, we just add them as needed. Now, if we go back to our output, it's changed again. All right, so notice now that our form, this is kind of interesting. We've made our buttons and our input, they've gotten gigantically long. This has to do with the height of the elements that they're inside of. Flex will automatically try to make the elements fit within that height, so they got really tall. They're not going to stay that way, so don't panic. We're going to get this fixed, but that's the first step that we're at. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we want to justify the content of our stuff to the center. Because right now, if we look at it, and I highlight the div, notice all that purple space on the side? So that means all of our elements right now are squished up against the left side of the screen. And what we want, as we've seen before in the example, is for these elements to be centered on the screen. So the way that we're going to do that is by using justify content. So we're going to create a new class. This one is called justify content center. And you may guess that the property name that we're going to be using is justify content. And the value that we're going to give it is center. So what justify content does, we'll go ahead and copy this, is that Flexbox has two axes, kind of like if anybody remembers doing like graphs in school and stuff where you have an x-axis and a y-axis. Well, justify content works along what's referred to as the primary axis for the flexed element. So by default, the primary axis is the x-axis or the horizontal axis. So in order to center our elements horizontally, we're going to use justify content on our div element. Okay, so we're going to say justify content center. All right, so now when we look back at our page, we'll notice that it's updated again. If we check the inspector and I highlight the element, we'll now see that the purple has been moved equally to the outsides of the container. And that's what justify content center does. It takes whatever available space it has and then it evenly divides it to the outside. If we select the element, we can briefly take a look at what some of the other properties can do. So center will center it, and we can see that. End will move everything to the end, essentially the opposite of the default. Flex end is a similar property. Flex start will move everything to its original location on the left. Left does the same thing. Right is pretty similar to end. There's a lot of properties and some of them do very similar things. Space around will divide the space and kind of move it both between and around the elements. Space between will take all the available space and put it between the elements. And space evenly will evenly distribute the available space between all of the elements. So we're going to stick with center because that's the one that we want to use. But it's worth knowing that Flexbox does allow for a lot of control as far as where your elements break down. All right, so now that we got that going, we're moving centered, we're getting there. We're not quite there yet, but we're still working on it. All right, the next thing that we want to do is we want to stack these elements vertically. So again, by default, Flexbox is going to put them all on a single line. And we don't want that. We want them the way that we have it in the example, which is we have everything stacked vertically. So the way that we can do that is by creating another class called Flex Column. So Flexbox has what's called a flex direction property. And the default value is row. So row meaning to go horizontally across, right? Essentially the primary axis being on the x-axis. Column, when we change it to that, basically changes the primary axis to the y-axis. So what we're doing is saying, I no longer want to have these elements go horizontally. I want them to go vertically. So I want the primary axis to be the y-axis. All right, so we get that. Go ahead and copy that class name, save the file, and we're going to add it to our container class. All right, so we're going to say flex column. And if we go back to the guessing game, it's changed up a little bit again. Notice now we are vertically centered. Now remember, justify content controls the position on the primary axis. When we switch the primary axis to Y, justify content is now controlling it that way. And we can see that. Take a quick look. So we have justify content center. And if we get rid of those values again and say do something like end, it'll put it all the way to the bottom. So the end of the container. Start, we'll have it at the top. And then we can do things like space between, space evenly. So again, Flexbox gives you a lot of options. But the big takeaway here is that by changing the flex direction to column, that should be center. By changing the flex direction to column, we've now moved the primary axis to the y-axis, and we're moving our elements that way. All right. So we're on our way. We're almost there. Oh, not the breakdown. The next thing that we're going to add is a way to center the elements on the secondary axis, because we've done the primary justify content. This time we want to use align items, and we can guess the value. It's going to be center. Now, it's worth pointing out that these class names are completely arbitrary. You can use any names you want for them. They're similar to variables. The reason that we're using these names is because they fit the CSS that we're applying. So just worth pointing that out. Okay, so we're looking for align items, and then we want to use center. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy that. And we're going to put that on the same element, which is our div element. All right, so if we check our guessing game now, ooh, we've gotten so much closer. Now everything is centered, both vertically and horizontally, but we still have the form elements kind of on one single line, and we want to do something about that. Now, we looked up here, and how did we make the elements stack vertically? It was the use of flex column. So we can go ahead and use that one again, this time on the form. And if we save that and go back, ooh, we've got there. This is the good stuff. So now we have everything, all of the elements are horizontally and vertically centered, and all of the form elements, or form controls as they're often referred to, are also stacked vertically. So we've gotten much closer to our example output, but there's still some work to do. Now let me copy this real quick, and we'll put that in our code pen, and then I will also, let me put it in the chat first. So that's the most updated version. And then also with our CSS. So there we go. Okay, so we got that set up. I'll go ahead and put it in my code pen. There we are. I'm going to attach you back up here. So let's copy that. Oh, let's put it in the right place. And then the CSS. And we should get the same output. Awesome. All right, so we're on our way. Now, looking between here and here, who can tell me some of the differences that still remain? Oh, got a question from Farouk. Why is the submit input and label suddenly became the same width? Is that the default thing? Very good question. Yeah, in the same way that the buttons, remember, or the button and the input became really tall and really wide. So because Flex is controlling the elements now, that is the default thing. It's going to make them be the same width. All right, so now that we have this set up, who can tell me, again, what's the differences that we still have between these two? I'm excited to see what people put. Spacing between. Awesome. Very true. Yeah. So if we look here, we have space between the label and between the input. Center input guess. Oh yeah. So right. So we need some spacing here. And we'll also notice that the text is not centered. So there's something that we're also going to have to adjust. Height. Yep. We look at the inputs and the button. The input and the button here, they are definitely taller than these ones. So we have to do something about that. So we really hit on a lot of good stuff. The first thing that we're going to touch on is adding the spacing between the elements. So remember before, and we can go ahead and inspect now. If we look at the H1 element, there we go. So the H1 element has that built-in margin. And when we highlight it, we can see that margin on the top and bottom. So if we want to add space between different elements, the way that we do that is by using margin. Okay, so if we go to style CSS, we're going to create a new class, and this one's going to handle the margin for us. So we're going to call this one MB for margin bottom, and then we're going to say -1, -5. And that's going to represent the size of the margin that we're going to be using. So the property that we want to use here is margin bottom. And then the value we're going to use is 1.5 REM. So REM refers to a way of factoring your any size. It could be a font size. It could be the amount of margin that you're using. It could be the size of an element. There's a lot of things it can be used for. But what it stands for is REM stands for the size of the letter M based on the root font size, which is by default is 16 pixels. So what this number is a factor of that. So what we're saying is 1.5 times the size of the letter M at 16 pixels. All right, so we got that there. We have our class, and we're going to add that in a couple of places where we need it. So the first place that we're going to add it is on the label element. All right, so let's go ahead and add it there. Now we don't have a class attribute here, so we're going to add one. And then we're going to go ahead and put in there MB-1-5. All right, so we got that set up. Now, if we go back to our output, we can see that, so we have it on the label. We now have spacing between the label and the input, and that's what we were looking for. We can see now that we still need spacing between the input and the button. So we can go to the input, and we can also add a class attribute there. And then we say margin bottom -1-5 and save that. All right, and now we've added our spacing. So between just adding that one class, we're moving ourselves in the right direction. Now, it was also noted that the height of the elements is not the same, and that's something that we're going to adjust. And the way that we're going to use that, to do that, is by using padding. So where margin adds space between the elements, padding adds space between the content of the element and the edges of the element. So that's going to give us some more height here for our input and our button. So going back into style CSS, we're going to create a new class, and we're going to call this P1 for padding 1 REM. And this time we're just going to say padding and then 1 REM. All right, so we'll notice a difference here. On this one, we're saying margin bottom. And what that means is we only want to add margin to the bottom of the element. That's the only place that we want to add it. And if we inspect our elements that we added it to, we can see that the margin only exists on the bottom, right? Padding, in this case, and margin works the same way, but by using only the padding property here, just one property, it's going to add the padding to all 4 sides of the element, not just the bottom, the top, the left, or the right. So by using it by itself, just padding, that means apply whatever I give to it if I'm only using one value to all sides of the element. All right, so we have a P1 class, and we're going to want to add that to our input. So we can just do P-1. All right. And then if we go to the button, we're going to add a class attribute to that one, and then the same class P1. All right, so now that we added that, and we go back to the guessing game, ooh, we're getting so much closer. So now the inputs look to be about the right height. The submit guess button looks to be about the right height. Looks like we're just down to the font sizes now. So we can notice here that the guessing game font size is definitely bigger on the example, and the label, placeholder text, and button text are also bigger. So that's going to be our next thing to fix. We're getting close here. We're almost done with the HTML and CSS. All right, the next class that we're going to create is going to be called FS3. Oh, let me type in the actual code there, S-3. So that represents font size 3 REM. All right, so for this one, we're just going to add that to the H1 element, because that's the element that we want to make the really big text. So we'll add a class attribute here, and then we'll go ahead and paste FS3 there. There we go. And if we go back to our output, awesome. Our title has now gotten to be the right size. So if you look here on the right, guessing game is now nice and big, and it matches what we have in the example. So we're almost there. The next thing we're going to do is create one more font size class. and we're going to say 1-2 because we're going to do 1.2 REM here. And again, these class names are arbitrary, other than they are holding, essentially they're designed to give information about what the class is doing, which is always a good thing. All right, so now we have FS-1-2, and we can see that's going to be needed on our label, on our input, and on the button. So let's add it to all of those places. So first we'll go to the label, and we'll add that class there. Then we'll go to our input, and we'll add it there. And then on the button, we'll also add it there. All right, so now when we look at our output, it matches. Well, isn't that great? We've gotten to the point, thank you, Farouk. We've gotten to the point where our input, everything's looking correct, thankfully. All right, so let me go ahead and, oh, was it 1.5 was too big. That's why it looked kind of big. Okay, let's fix that, 1.2, so I can follow my own advice. There we go. All right, much better. All right, so now that we have our HTML and CSS pretty much completed, we're just about ready to move into our JavaScript. So let's get the most updated version of this. I'm going to post this in the chat. So you now have the most updated version of our HTML and CSS. And then I'll paste that in my CodePen too, so we can confirm that our output is correct. Did I miss the div? Oh, no, I didn't. Okay, good. And there we go. Oh, it looks like we do have one final thing, and that's this text right here inside of input guess. That should be, based on our example, centered. So we're going to add one more CSS class, and we'll just call it center text. All right, so center text, we're going to just say text align is the property that we want to use. And we want to use center. Okay. So text align center allows you to center the text within an element. It's very useful stuff. We go back to our index HTML, and then we will add that to our input. Okay, and then go to our output, and there it is, input guess. Very cool. Awesome. All right, so that pretty much has us, I don't know what happened to my JS file. That pretty much has us set up as far as HTML and CSS goes. We may make a tiny change here and there as we're moving forward, but that's it so far. Okay. All right, and we're doing pretty good on time, about halfway there. Okay, so that's going to move us into the JavaScript section. So let's go back to our breakdown. Check here. There needs to be a way to enter a guess. So we got our heading, we got our form and our button. That's all completed. That moves us on to section 2, which is there needs to be a way to check the guess and let the user know if the guess was correct. All right, so a random number will need to be created to represent the correct number the user needs to guess to win. So the first thing that we're going to do is generate a random number, and that random number will be the number that we use, or the user has to guess when they're playing the game. All right. So putting together a random number is kind of fun. Give me 1 second as I get some water. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to define a variable. And we're going to use that doing the const keyword. So what the const keyword means is I'd like to define a variable, and I don't want the value of this variable to change while the code is running. So we're going to call the variable answer. And then we're going to use equal sign, which is the assignment operator. So we've defined a variable, and we put the assignment operator in. Now, everything that we put on the right-hand side will be doing whatever calculations or whatever value we want to assign to the answer variable. So we're going to be using some built-in JavaScript functionality to do this. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to access the math object. So in JavaScript and many other languages, there is a math object, and it basically has a lot of like functions attached to it called methods and properties that will give us math-related things. So like if you need the value of pi, that's stored on the math object. the method that we're going to use here is called floor. Oh, and we got to use a dot for that. So if you say math.floor, that means I want to access the floor method of the math object. And to call that method, I'm going to add parentheses. So parentheses, I kind of like to think of it like this, like you're, hello, like you're wrapping to call to somebody. So we're doing a function call, or in this case, a method call. Now, you may hear method and function used together. They are very similar. A method is a function that's attached to an object. And you can tell that it's attached to an object because of this dot operator right here. So it means that this function, the floor method, is attached to this math object. So we call it a method. So the floor method. But as far as functionality goes between a function and a method, they work the same. Okay, so what the floor method does is it will take a value, what they call a float value, or you might be more familiar with the term a decimal value, and it will remove any decimal point and drop the value to the lower integer. So if we had a number like 3.5 and we gave it to the floor method, it's going to give us in return the number 3. If we had 3.7, it'll give us 3. If we had 3.999999999, it's going to give us 3. So any decimal value or any float value that you give to floor, it's going to give you the next lower integer number. And that's what we want to do in this case, and we'll explain why in just a second. So what do we want to give to floor? And that's the question that we have to answer, because floor is going to take whatever number we give to it and drop it to the next integer. And we want to be able to generate a value that's between 1 and 25. That's what we want to store and answer. So the first thing that we're going to do is use the math object again, and we're going to call a method named random. So as we can see here, it returns a pseudo-random number between 0 and 1. The reason it says pseudo-random is that JavaScript does use specific algorithms for generating its random numbers. So it's not purely random. There are ways of figuring out like how it generates its numbers. But it's going to be random enough for our uses. And notice it says between 0 and 1. It does not say between 0 and 1 inclusive. Random will never return the number 1. It can return anything from 0 to 0.999 for as many floating points as JavaScript can handle. But it will never give you 1. So we need to be aware of that. Now, the next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to multiply the number that we get from random by the highest number that we want to have for our range. So our case, it's 25. So we're going to use 25 here. Now, if it was 100, we could put 100, whatever the top range we want of the random numbers, that's the value that we give here that we multiply times the random call. Okay, so that's going to give us that. So essentially, and you can imagine, it's going to give us a number between 0 and 1, and then we're going to multiply it by 25. But if it's between 0 and 1, but never includes 1, can we ever get 25? And the answer to that is no. So when we're generating random numbers and we want to do a range like this, we call floor, we pass it the call to random multiplied by the top level of the range, and then we add the low level of the range. In this case, we want to go 1 to 25, so we can say +1. But if we wanted to go 5 to 25, we could do +5. It's just the thing to remember here is that this is the top of the range, and this is the low end of the range. And that's what we want to keep in mind. All right. So the first thing that we're going to do after we've generated our random number is we're going to confirm that we're actually generating a random number. So the way that we're going to do that is by using another method on another object, and this is called the console log. So notice, again, we're using the dot. So on the left is the name of the object, the console object. The right is the name of the method we're using. So this is the log method of the console object. Now, what it's used for is to print values to the console in the browser so that you can actually essentially look inside the code and see what the value is going to be or what the value actually is. So what we pass to that as an argument or the value we want to give to the function is the variable that we want to log to the console. In this case, that's answer, right? Because we've generated a random number on this line, and then this line is going to actually look at that number. So if we save it, and I go open the inspector again, and we go to console, the console tab, we can see the number that was generated. And it even tells us what line the console log was on. So if I click on it, it'll take us to the JS file that the browser's actually using and says, there's where your console log was. So we have the number 13. Now, on Mac, it's Command R. On Windows, it's Control R, but you can refresh the page. So as I refresh the page, our expectation should be that we get different values each time because these are random numbers. So refresh 11, 20, 10, 5, 11. Seems like we're pretty good. All right, so we are successfully creating our random number. So if we go back here to our problem breakdown, the first thing, a random number will need to be created to represent the correct number the user needs to guess to win. We have completed that. All right. So from here, we can get rid of that console log because we're done with that. Always good idea to delete them when you're done with them. And we can go on to the next thing. All right, so the next step is the location of the form will need to be found so the user's guess can be accessed when the user submits the form. Okay, so we're going to have to essentially use JavaScript to locate the form so that we can get the value of it when we submit it. So the way that a web page is, it's a good way to say that it's represented for the web page is a giant object that has a bunch of properties associated with it. And that's called the document object. So what we're going to do is search the document for the form so that we can do something when we submit the form. All right. So first we're going to define a variable. And we're going to start it with a $sign. Now, when you see a $sign being used for a variable in JavaScript, it typically means that it's being used to store a reference to an element on the web page. And that's why we do that. So it's like, oh, okay, this is storing a web element. So we're going to call this variable game form. You'll notice that the first word is lowercase, and then when we get to the second word, it starts with an uppercase letter. And that's because this is called camel case. It's a very popular in JavaScript for doing variables. All right, and then we're going to set an equal sign because we want to assign something to game form. And on the right side, then we're going to have to write the code that actually accesses the form. Now, if we go back to our index.html and look at the form, we could select it by these classes, but we don't want to do that. We want to select it using an ID. And the reason for that is twofold. One, IDs are much faster when you search the document, because every time you search the document for something, it can actually take in computer time a very long time. IDs have to be unique on a web page, so they're typically very fast to find. So we're going to add an ID property to the form, and we're going to call it game form. Get that a capital F. All right, so we added an ID to the form. We'll go back into the JS. And now we're going to use another object called the document object. So the document object, again, is the object that contains all of the elements for the web page. It has a method on it called getElementById. Notice the use of camel case, getElementById. And that's a method, so we can call it. And the value that we pass to it is the ID that we want to select from the web page. In this case, that's game form. All right. So now we've written some code that we guess has selected the element, but we're going to confirm that. And the way that we're going to do that again is using console log. So for console log, the value that we're going to check is game form. All right. Oh, so notice that when I refresh the page, because my pages will automatically refresh because I'm using live server to check everything, we can see that when we console log, we now have the element. And it has the label, the input, and all that stuff inside of it. And I believe, yeah, it's kind of cool that you can highlight it too here. and you can see all the elements. So we've definitely confirmed that we have properly selected the form. So now we have the form and we have access to that. All right, we're in good shape. So we can get rid of that console log. Okay, so now that we've found the form, the next thing we have to do is tell JavaScript that when the form is submitted, that we want it to do something. In this case, we want it to get the guess from the form. So to do that, we're going to create an event listener is what they're referred to as. So if I go to our page and like I'm just moving the mouse around right now, I'm not doing anything other than moving the mouse. It's actually firing off on the web page events all the time. They call them like mouse move events. So just when you're moving. Now, if I put the cursor over the top of the heading like that, that's a hover event. So as I'm moving the cursor over these elements, it's actually doing hover events on them. If I click on the input and it focuses on the input, that's a focus event. When I click on the submit guess, that's a submit event. So events are happening constantly. What we can do if we want to is we can tell elements to listen for events. And then when they hear them, they will do something in response. So we want to listen for the submit event. And the way that we're going to do that is by accessing the game form, because that's where we have our form stored. And we're going to set that equal to another document method. I'm sorry, not another document method. My brain froze for a second. This method is directly on the element. It is called the add event listener method. Okay, so the add event listener method allows us to add an event listener to an element. Pretty self-explanatory on that one. But again, we want to keep in mind that events are happening all the time, and we're just specifically saying, I want you to listen for one type of event. So the add event listener method takes a couple of arguments. The first argument that it takes, or the first data that we pass to it, tells it what event we want it to listen for. And we want it to listen for a submit event. That's what we want it to do. Okay, so we say, okay, game form, I want you to listen for a submit event. And game form says, okay, I'll do that. What would you like me to do when that happens? So in order to have it do something, we're going to create what's called a callback function. So a callback function is a function that we essentially create and give to someone. In this case, we're going to give it to add event listener. And then we're not going to call it, but it will be called later when that event happens. And we'll see how that works, so don't worry. So we're going to call this function. You got to use the function keyword. Then we're going to call it handle, I believe it's handle game form. That's what we want. It's very typical when you're doing event listeners to start off the function name with handle, as it's handling the event. Not required. It could be any function name, but that's just a typical thing that we use. All right, then we create our parentheses, and inside of here, when we're doing our definition of a function, we're going to put a variable in there, and we're going to call this variable event. The other name for that is a parameter. So when you define a function, you give it parameters, and parameters are just variables that the function is going to store values in. So for example, get element by ID. Inside of this function, if we could see it, there would be a parameter that stores this value as it comes in. So then the function can use it and do something with it. The reason we're calling this parameter event is that when game form calls this function, it's going to pass an event object into it. So event is a good name for the variable. It doesn't have any specific like functionality attached to event. We could call it T, we could call it ET. It could have any name. But in this case, because it's going to receive an event object, we're going to call it event. You also might see very often used E in documentation. As anybody like watch videos and stuff, a lot of times you'll see them use E. But we can go ahead and spell it out. All right. After we add the parameter or the variable that's going to catch the value that's passed to the function, the next thing that we're going to do is make sure the function's properly getting called. So an easy way that we can do that is we can say console log. And then we'll just go ahead and console log the event. All right, so this function is very simple. It has one parameter event, and then when it gets called, it's just going to log the value of that variable out. All right, now that we've created our function, we can pass it as the second argument to add event listener. So we can say handle game form. Oh, if I could spell it. Should be using autocomplete. All right. So notice here that I'm not calling this function, right? It's just a name. Calling it, I would have to include the parentheses. Remember the parentheses. But since I'm not calling this function, I'm handing this function to game form. And I'm saying, hey, game form, when the form is submitted, when this event happens, I want you to call this function. And game form says, no problem, I'll do that for you. All right, so we have that set up now. And we have our console log for the event. So the next thing that we want to check is whether or not that's working properly. Put that down for a second. All right. We'll get our console open, and this is our guessing game. All right, so our expectation is that when we submit the form, we should see the event from the form submit show up over here on in the console. Let's see what happens. I'm going to give it a number 5. Well, that was weird. We saw something very briefly. Did everybody see that? We'll do it again. We'll try 6 this time. Oh, did the same thing. That's actually expected functionality. Remember, I did say that forms have a lot of built-in functionality. One of the things that it has is that when a form is submitted, that action attribute that we're not using, it tries to submit to that attribute. If that attribute does not exist, the form will submit itself back to the browser. So if we look up here now in the URL, we can see that beyond the name of the file that's open, we have a question mark, and then we have guess equals 6. So that guess is this guess. So remember, we put the name guess on there. So that's how we can identify the input. So if we look up here, it says guess equals 6, which is correct. That is the value that I passed in. If I put 5 in there, it'll now say 5. So the form is submitting properly, but the problem that we have is that every time it's submitting, it's refreshing the page. And when it refreshes the page, it dumps all the memory from the previous run and all that stuff is gone. So our console log disappears. But we can fix that. So going back into our main.js, we're going to add a line of code at the top of this function. And for pretty much any form that you create, if you're using JavaScript to handle it, you will need this to call this method. And it is the prevent, there we go, default. All right, so what prevent default does kind of depends on what you're using it for. When you're using it for a form like this, it prevents that default behavior of resubmitting the form to the browser and refreshing the page. So now that we've made this change, we can expect that our event object will show up. So let's try this again. Do 6 and submit. Oh, and there it is. Okay, so we've properly stopped the page from refreshing, and now we have our submit event. Okay. So now that we have the event, what we need to do is find the guess value, because we haven't located that yet. We can see up here, this is the previous one, 5, but we need to get that value in our JavaScript so that we can use it to determine if the person guessed correctly or not. So the first thing that we're going to do is get to this target property. So the target property is going to represent, this is a very technical term, but it's going to represent the element which dispatches the event. What that means is that whatever element that we interact with, in this case, it's the form that's submitting, that is the element that's going to be stored on the target property of the event object. So if we go here and we add target and refresh the page, when we submit again, we should see the form. And there it is. All right. So remember, the target property of the event object will always refer to the element which dispatches the event, essentially the element that you interact with. So the one where the event originates from. So there we go. We have our form, and that's pretty good. Now, that's not the guess. So we're going to have to keep looking. Now, one problem that we have is that when we look at this console log, can I see any of those properties? Remember when we logged the form before, we got to see like it was all these different properties and we got to see like the structure of it and everything. Well, we don't get to see that here. So what we're going to do is use a different method on console, and that's called the dir method. So what the dir method does is it will print, when you give it an element, it will print that element as an object so that we can see all of that stuff. So if we go back to the guessing game now and we hit, let's go ahead and submit 5, we can now see the element in all its glory as an object. So if we click on this down arrow, we're going to start seeing all of the properties that are associated with it. Notice up here for 0 and 1, we have our input and our button. So those are form controls on the form. But the property that we're looking for is called elements. And there's a lot of stuff on here. It has like the children. So whatever elements that are children of the form, whatever classes that it has on it, there's a lot of stuff. But elements is what we're looking for. So if you look at elements, it has 3 things in it. It has our input guess. It has the button using 0 and 1, and then there's that guess name. So the property that we created on the input guess for the name attribute is right here on elements. Okay, so let's go ahead and then we can actually switch back to the log method now. And we're going to say, I want to see elements. So we'll go one more level deep in the object. All right, so let's submit this time. Okay, and it tells us that elements contains an HTML form controls collection. So basically it contains a couple of elements. And if we look at it, we'll see the same thing that we saw in there before, 0, 1, and guess. All right, so we want to get to guess, so we can add another dot. And then we'll submit again. All right, and then there's our input. That looks good. So we have the input and we've properly gotten to that, but there's one more thing we have to do. And I'm going to switch it back to dir so that we can see that. Okay, so when we submit for the input, we can take a look. And the property that we're looking for is all the way down here. And it's called value. There it is. And see value 5, because that was the value that I put into the form. So value should be the property that we're looking for. So we can do one more dot, and we're going to say value. I'm going to switch this back to console log, because now we're just looking for a value. And the expectation is that we should see that value pop up here. So let's try it. All right, there we go. So there it is. It's number 7. That's what we entered. We can click here to check out the line of code, and it's right where we put our console log. So we have now accessed the guess. We made it all the way to the guess. That's pretty cool. Okay, so let me give you the updated code that we have so far so that you can post this in your pen. I'll put it in mine. Did have to add that ID for the form, so we'll update that. And then I'll put the updated HTML here in the chat for everybody. And then the same thing for the JS code. Oh, we got a question. Is event an object and target elements and the rest of the chain are like sub-objects, or what are they called? Very good question. So it's objects essentially all the way down. So event is an object. Target is an object because that's the actual element itself. Elements is a property that contains an object. Guess is an element, which is an object. And value is just a property. It's not an object in and of itself. So it just holds a number. JavaScript uses objects at many levels, and many things can be represented as objects in JavaScript. Objects are like a super integral part of the way JavaScript structures. Does that answer your question? Yes, so objects can be part of other objects. So you can have an object that has a value, a property with a value of an object, and that one could have a property that has a value of an object and as many levels deep as you'd like to go. You're welcome. Good question. All right. So we're able to get the guess. Where did I put my breakdown? Did I lose it? Oh, here it is. All right. So we got a random number. We got that. The location of the form, we found that. And we got the guess. So we got that. So now we're here where when the user submits the form, the guess must be checked to see if it's correct. All right. So the next stage that we have to get to is actually checking the guess. Now we could do that within this handle game form function, but that could get kind of messy as we add more and more code. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to create a new variable. Oh, let's give it a name. We can call it guess. That makes sense. And we're going to set that equal to the event.target.elements.guess.value, because we know this is where the value is located. So now we're going to have a variable that actually contains that value. And what we're going to do to check the guess is we're going to create a new function, and we're going to call that one check guess. All right. For check guess, we are going to give it one parameter, and we'll go ahead and call it guess. That makes sense. And we're going to do the first thing that we should always do when creating a new function. We're going to make sure it works and it's getting called. So we're going to add a console log here, and we're going to console log the guess variable. So this parameter right here. Now up here, we're going to call our check guess function, and we're going to pass it our guess as an argument. So what should happen is when we submit the form, the game form will call handle game form. It's going to pass the event object into handle game form. We're going to stop the page from refreshing. We're going to access the guess from the form, and then we're going to call the check guess function and pass the guess that we got from the form into that function. So what we're going to do here in check guess then, the first thing is just log out the guess, make sure that we're actually calling the function correctly. It's very important that we test and test and test as we go. It makes our lives much easier. And I promise that even when I'm writing code myself, I do the same thing, because it makes life a lot easier. Okay, so the expectation is if we put a value in here, it should show up in the console from that function we just created. Let's see if it works. Ah, there we go. So we got our guess, it's 6. If we go to main.js, there's our console log, works guess. The function is properly being called. It looks like we're in good shape. All right, so now that we've proved that that's working, we're going to add the code here that's going to check the guess for us. All right, we're coming up on the end of it. We're getting close. So the way that we can check values, see if they're like equal to, greater than, or less than another value is by using conditional statements in JavaScript. Specifically, we're going to be using an if statement. So an if statement allows you to give it an expression, and if that expression evaluates to true, it will do some code. If it does not evaluate to true, it won't do anything. So what we have to figure out is what we want to check for in relation to guess. Now we have answer, so that's the answer that we're trying to get to. So if we want to check guess in relation to answer, the first thing that we can check is if it's too high, right? So we can say if guess is greater than answer, we want it to do something. Does this make sense if guess is greater than answer? Cool. Got a thumbs up. Seems like we're in a good spot. All right. So after we've created our conditional statement and the expression that can evaluate to true or false, we're going to give it a code block. So what we're going to say is, if this is true, we want to do something. And the thing we want to do in this case is we're going to call an alert. So alert is a function that's built into JavaScript, and it's what makes those little pop-ups show up at the top of the window. We could be much more complex with it, and we could build like a pop-up that shows up and looks nice and all that. But for the purposes of what we're doing, an alert is going to work perfect for that. So we just got to give it a message that we want it to show, and we're going to say your guess was too high. Just like he said about the rent. The rent is too high. All right. So your guess is too high. So if this is true, if your guess is greater than the answer value, then the guess is too high. Now, once we have that, we can think, okay, what's the next thing we have to check? What if the guess is too low? So if we want to add an additional conditional that's related to the first one, say the first one doesn't hit, but we want to check something else, we can use what's called an else if statement. So an else if statement basically says, if the conditional above me is not true, let's check this condition and see if it's true. So in this case, we want to do guess is less than answer. All right, so if the guess is less than answer, we can expect that we'll do another alert. And that alert should be your guess is, oh, let's go, was too low. We want to make sure to have those exclamation points. All right. Okay, so now we've set up this function to say if your guess is too high, if it's higher than the answer or greater than the answer, the guess is too high. And if it's less than the answer, it's too low. And those are pretty much the only two things that we have to check for, because in this case, our value can either be too high or it can be too low. And that's really it as far as what we're doing. So what we can do then is use an else statement. The else statement means if either of these conditionals don't happen, do this thing. So by default, no matter if these ones aren't correct, I'm going to do something. And that something that I'm going to do is I'm going to let the user know that your guess was correct. And they get 3 exclamation points for that because they won. All right. So now we're generating an answer. We found the form. We gave the form, we created a listener on it for submit events, and we gave it a function and said, when that submit events happens, call this function. When the submit event happens, it does call the function, the game form does, it passes in the event object. We stop the page from refreshing, we get the guess, and then we pass the guess value to the check guess function, and then the check guess function checks it for us. So let's find out if we got what we wanted to. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with 12. We can start in the middle. The guess was too high. Okay. Let's try 6, split the difference. The guess is too low. So we know it's between 6 and 12. Let's try 9. That'll split the difference again. And that's too high. So it has to be either 7 or 8. 50-50 didn't work last time. Let's see how it works this time. Oh, didn't work this time either. That's why I do not go to Vegas. All right, so let's try 7. Your guess was correct. All right. So that lets us know that at least we think it's working, right? But we didn't check what the answer was, so we want to make sure to do that. So at the top of our check guess function, we're going to use our console log again. And we're going to put answer here. So that way that we can see if the answer is actually correct and we can do some proper testing. Because otherwise we really don't know if it's working or not. Okay, so let's go ahead and start again. Start with 12. Okay, so the guess is too high. That's the message we get. And if we look over here, the value of answer is 2. So that seems to be correct. So we can test again by using the value 1. And that should tell us that it's too low. All right, your guess was too low. Sounds good. So if we try 2, it should let us know that that's correct. And your guess was correct. Awesome. It seems like we got there. So let me copy this code. And let me go ahead and post that in the channel for everybody. So that's the final code for the JS. And I can put that in my own bin. And I left the console log in there in case you want to play with this later so you can actually see what the answer is. And it will work here also. So if we inspect and go to the console, you're going to see a lot of other stuff in there. That's okay. Let's try it here. We'll say 12. So the answer is 23. We can see that. It says our guess was too low, and it was. Let's try going above it to make sure that still works. Your guess was too high. Okay. And then if we put 23, awesome. We nailed it. All right. And that pretty much does us a guessing game. I can go ahead and stop sharing now. I don't have to stop sharing. Does anybody have any questions about anything that thank you, Jocelyn. Does anybody have any questions about the code, about anything that we've done so far? I'll start sharing again if need be. Oh, you're very welcome, Farouk. And as noted, we will be sending out this video to participants, so you guys will have access to it. And I'll also be sending out additional videos that cover the other functionality that's involved. The extended functionality that we talked about, like being able to set the range of numbers that you're choosing and how many times you can guess and stuff like that, I will be including, I'll be sending you all some videos that allow you to see how that works too, get a little bit of an extended functionality.
Thank you so much for hosting this, Brett. For the folks who made it all the way through, we will be having our next prep course, which is a preparation for our full-time programming. And you are very lucky to find out that Brett teaches our prep course. So if you enjoyed working with Brett tonight, you can get to spend some more time with him if you'd like to continue on in your learning journey. Tonight, we let you all be a little bit shy, be clamor off and not having to talk too much. But in our actual courses, it's a bit more engaging with the students chiming in, asking questions, because y'all were new and fresh tonight. We allow the shyness, but normally we're a chatty group and we're excited to get to know you and help support you in your journey. So if you are interested, I have the link in the chat there. You're also welcome to call us whenever you like. Take a look at learningfuze.com for other information. And there you are, Brett, with another link in the chat. Because you all joined us tonight, you can also use the discount code GUESS for guessing game, and that'll give you $500 off of a course if you choose to come and join us at a LearningFuze course. We do remote and in person out here in Irvine, California. But let us know if you have any questions, and thanks so much, Brett, for doing this tonight.
You're very welcome. And once again, the video will go out tomorrow to everybody so that you can check it out.